I want to tell you my secret now. I see dead people.
Silent Green is people!
No, I am your father.
What's in the box? You maniac! You blew it up! Damn you all to hell!
I love that opening. Hello and welcome to a very special live episode of the Slate Spoiler Special podcast. I'm Dana Stevens, Slate's movie critic, and tonight we're going to be spoiling Hamilton, or Hamil Film, the filmed version of the Broadway musical that is, as of last week, streaming on Disney+. Joining me from Slate are not one, not two, but three other great critics. I'll introduce them in the order in which they appear on my screen anyway. I don't know about yours. We have Sam Adams, who's a senior editor at Slate and the editor of our culture blog, Browbeat. Hey, Sam. Am I not? Sam, do you hear me? Okay. Also, and you're speaking to us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, correct? We also have down in the lower right quadrant. Sorry, I'm still hooking up my tag here. Rebecca is Slate's history blog.
No.
We need some technical help, guys. I can't hear anyone.
I can hear Dana now. Can y'all hear me?
Okay, hi, Rachel. Rachel, give me your title and where you're speaking from. Since I'm kind of technologically crippled right now, please help me.
I am speaking from Brooklyn, New York right now, the greatest city in the world.
I was going to say, there's 4 of us tonight, but tomorrow there'll be more of us. Wait, and remind me of your title at Slate?
Oh, I am a staff writer. Sorry, I forget that all the time. Yeah, I write for the culture section and for other sections as well.
So I think the first thing I'm going to do, usually on these spoiler specials, I go around and ask for just your kind of basic thumbs up, thumbs down opinion first. I do want that, but I also want to hear just in a little thumbnail version, your history with Hamilton. Because I know, for example, that Rebecca's a newbie who just watched it today for the first time. I know that also Rachel and Sam have some history with it. So let's go the opposite way. We'll start with you, Rachel. What's your history with Hamilton and how do you feel about the film?
So I love Hamilton. I was obsessed with Hamilton. I was embarrassingly part of the Hamilton fandom on Tumblr for a little while back when I was still on Tumblr. I first heard the cast soundtrack when I was studying abroad in France. So I was like kind of looking for a little taste of home, and I was like, oh my God, the American Revolution with people of color. I love to see it. And then I saw it on stage in Chicago in like 2016. It was the night after, in 2016. And then, ever since then, my love has slightly diminished as I've matured as an adult, but that's my history with it.
Yeah, the question of to what degree Hamilton is a kid's show, I think is interesting to talk about. And I hope we touch on that at some point. And I don't mean that at all. I mean, but I just know my kid, for example, is super into it. I bet that Sam's is as well, and it does have this kind of pedagogical quality, which I think Rebecca will soon be harshing on for our pleasure. But maybe that's part of what has made it appeal to younger kids so much. Okay, Rebecca, what about you? You watched it today for the first time, correct?
I did. I watched it today. So I had heard the soundtrack a little bit, way back in 2016. I think, I don't know if Slate was the first, but we were one of the first to run like a critical piece about Hamilton. And that was a Q&A that I did with a historian named Lyra Montero. And it basically was a argument, I'm sure many of the parts of which we'll be unpacking and addressing tonight, which is about whether the show itself is actually progressive in the way that it seems to think it is, whether the casting is sort of like a trick that's the only interesting thing about the politics of it, and that everything else is sort of, well, what you would call founders chic, like just like love of founding fathers. And I was completely convinced when I did that Q&A with Dr. Montero, and I said, yep, I agree. I never want to hear this. I think it sounds terrible, like a terrible idea. So, and I sort of listened to the soundtrack a little bit, and then I was like, oh, this is corny. So that's the other thing, is I thought it was kind of like politically annoying that people seem to love it so much. And then I also thought it was corny. And then finally today, after 5 years of discourse, 4 years, 5 years of discourse around it, and kind of seeing arguments about it banded back and forth, and seeing all the good coverage Slate has done of it over the years, and I know many of my colleagues are fans of it. I watched it, and well, I don't know. I still thought it was corny and kind of politically suspect. So, but we should. I feel like I have many more things to say about that. You can address that later.
And you're also not a musicals person in general, I gather, right?
No,
like you're someone who's always resisted musicals. Yeah. Although I know some of those people. I live with somebody who doesn't usually like musicals and has a lot of discomfort with the bursting into song spontaneously, whereas I just wish life were like that every day. And he loves Hamilton. So I don't think it's a rule of thumb one way or the other. All right, Sam, your turn.
Well, I guess my initial introduction to Hamilton was this like annoying thing at the public theater that my friends in New York kept tweeting about, and I was just like, okay, enough. Then the album came out, and it was the base of the soundtrack to my driving my, I guess then 6-year-old daughter back and forth to school, half an hour each way, like every day for a year, basically. And then it became it was the first show that I took her to when she was 7. We saw it at the tail end of the run with the original cast. I now know, because there are dates in the credits, the day after they shot the movie. Like they shot it up till Tuesday night. We saw it the Wednesday matinee the next day. So I love the show. I mean, I have it memorized. I think it is a great and complex work with flaws that it is strong enough to hold up to having them discussed. And it's had like a cataclysmic, in a good way, I guess, like profound effect on American theater. It's just shaking things up in a really interesting way, and I think that's great. Rebecca, since you felt like you had more to say on it, why don't you say some of that right now? And we can get the sort of the historical critique out of the way up front.
Okay, so I feel like there was a lot of sort of historical critiques to be made that are like of the sort of more nitpicky variety, and I kind of don't care as much about those as about the question of like, this is still a really white story, and I wonder what you guys think about that. I mean, and I read, again, it's because I read so many critiques before I saw the thing, right? So like, and I had even gone back and looked at some of the critiques again before I saw it today, and so I was looking for it and thinking about it. And even the parts of the story that seem to be trying to make Hamilton into an underdog, which like in some senses he was, but I mean, the point that it's sort of like he's an immigrant who's like really trying really hard to get to the top, but he was an immigrant from one part of the colonies to another part of the colonies. Like, it's not really the same. I don't know. There's a lot of sort of like a celebratory American success story to it that I feel like is unearned by the actual history. And I just wonder, Annette Gordon-Reed, the historian, said in one of the critiques that I reread this morning, if this was a cast of all white people, like, would this be an interesting show? And I think it's still, like, it's obviously virtuosic in the way that it's put together and written and executed. Even I, a musical theater fool, can see that, but it just bothers me. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Rachel, do you want to take that?
Yeah. I definitely, that resonates with me a lot. My first impression upon hearing it was like, as a 19-year-old Black kid in America, like, you don't really connect in any way, or at least I never connected in any way to like the founding mythos of this country. Like, it never felt like it included me. And so in a way, watching them race bend these people that we're so familiar with felt very progressive to me. It was kind of the first time I was like, I saw myself in this history. And then as I got older and kind of got more familiar with, not that I wasn't familiar, but I guess as I got older and just smarter, it just became very clear to me that it basically just allowed more people to have access to a myth. And so in a way, having access to that myth felt powerful when I was like 19, but as like a 24-year-old now, I'm kind of just like, I understand the appeal and I kind of understand like why so many people connected with it, but it also just kind of traffics in so much of what we're tearing down right now. Like listening to it now and what they were in, hearing Christopher Johnson as Washington saying, like, the people are rioting, there's a difference.
Right.
And kind of in the moment we're in, there's just so much about it that just you're like this. We're actively tearing down statues of these people, and yet I'm also obsessed with this play that kind of deifies them in this way and makes it more in a very like surface level way. Like there are people in American history in that period who are progressive and who do kind of have the same kind of ideological standards that we're holding them to. Like the first person to die in the Revolutionary War, some say, is Crispus Attucks, who was indigenous and Black. And so we don't see those people in history, and we don't see them in Hamilton. And so the people we do see in Hamilton are like 21st century avatars of diversity. And that's not really what any kind of like decolonizing of history is supposed to be about, really.
Right.
Yeah. Didn't Mike Pence go to see it like a couple of days after he got into office? Yeah, for example, like that's not threatening Mike Pence's vision of American history. For example, yeah.
Well, but then at the end of the show, Brandon Dixon, who was I think playing Burr at the time, like came to the lip of the stage and like told him off.
I remember. Yeah.
So he was. I mean, I wouldn't say he was directly threatened by that, but he was directly confronted by the cast, at the show, and basically saying like, don't use your attendance at our show to kind of present yourself as something you're not. You're not some sort of like whatever, like post-racial hipster just because you like managed to talk your way into Hamilton. One thing that was interesting for me, I saw the screener of this. I think it was a few days before it actually arrived on Disney Plus, and there was an introduction to it, which I was surprised didn't end up on Disney Plus. I guess it was just for press, but it was Lin-Manuel Miranda and Thomas Kail who directed the stage production and the film. In their respective quarantines, on headphones, talking about it, and Lin-Manuel Miranda said two interesting things about that have really stuck with me. One is that this is originally going to be a theatrical release coming out in October of 2021. They're releasing it now, because there are no movies, because In the Heights, which was supposed to be the big, Hollywood blockbuster of his previous musical, has now been pushed to next summer. But another thing he said is like, we can't gather right now. Like those were his words. And I think that's really kind of a powerful idea to me, that like so much of what's been taken from us right now is the ability to experience live theater or music or any kind of performance together in a public space, in a physical proximity to other people. And the other thing he said is, and this just kind of went by, like he didn't make an emphatic point of it, but he said that what he was proudest of with Hamilton is the opportunities that he was able to give to people. And one way to think of the show, and it doesn't answer the historical questions one way or the other, but is just as a sort of like huge floating jobs program for Black and brown theater actors. Many of the people in this production, I mean, most of them were not, stars when they were cast. Seeing in them this production, it's kind of impossible to believe that wasn't the case. It's sort of impossible to believe 5 years after the show landed on Broadway that all of them aren't huge stars now. I mean, I as a writer, I'm sort of selfishly grateful that the person who got the most fame and money out of this big production was the person who wrote it. But it is kind of bizarre that like Daveed Diggs and Renee Elise Goldsberry are like on every TV show and in every movie until now. But I mean, that is, I think you have to sort of factor in just its like real world effect, on top of its significance, sort of a, standalone, work of musical theater in history.
Yeah, I think the most progressive thing about Hamilton isn't necessarily its ideology, but it's like the actual, like the praxis of it, to use an overused word right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm having a what did I miss moment over here. Because when I tapped out, Rebecca was just starting to talk about, I mean, essentially kind of the whitewashing of the show, right? The fact that it uses the multiracial casting to sort of cover for its essentially conservative nature as a celebration of the Founding Fathers, right? That was basically kind of your argument, right?
Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering, I heard that little bit as I was losing touch with you all, but I want to hear what the next round of talk was after that. Like, Rachel, I know you had something to say about the kind of colorblind casting idea and how that feels different now than when the show first aired.
Yeah, definitely. As I said, when we were in the ether, when I first saw it, it felt very progressive to me because, I mean, just I don't have any connection to the founding fathers of America, just because, I mean, they owned people who looked like me and people who were probably related to me in some way. And so I think when I first watched it, it felt progressive. The colorblind casting felt progressive in a way where I was like, I can see myself in like George Washington. But then 4 years later, as we're tearing down statues of people who like the founding fathers, it's kind of like, why do I necessarily want to feel a connection to George Washington? And kind of what's left out of Hamilton that would have actually made it progressive. Like, it's kind of weird watching it back, hearing Hamilton kind of go after Jefferson for owning slaves when most of the people on that stage that they're representing owned slaves. Like, he married into a prominent slave-owning family. Like, those people are missing. Like, the only time we really hear references like in Cabinet Battle, and then when Thomas Jefferson mentions Sally Hemings. And if you don't know who Sally Hemings is, just hear him say, Sally, can you go get this for me? And so I think there were, like, I think the casting was great on like a fundamental practical level in terms of getting a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise have opportunities in the door, as Sam was saying. But in terms of actually being progressive in its like ideology, it doesn't necessarily hold up.
Right. Well, I
It's
mean,
especially interesting to think that there's like, I mean, there is like a third cabinet battle that was cut from the show, but it is, you know, recorded. There's a demo online where like Hamilton directly goes at like a cabinet battle about slavery, and it's about, you know, the Briefless Compromise and sort of saying like, well, look, we'll deal with this, you know, in 1808 or whatever it is. And, you know, and there's like an explicit, Hamilton drops sort of an explicit like Sally Hemings diss bomb, and that like he really goes right after him for that. And it's interesting to think that he thought that was important enough to write, and then that he cut it from the show.
That's really interesting.
Maybe because it was too distracting, or, you know, if you open up that Pandora's box, you kind of can't then not deal with that for the entire rest of the show. But that's, you know, worth factoring in.
There's definitely a thing where Thomas Jefferson gets to carry the guilt of slavery for all of the founding fathers, and like not just in Hamilton, but in a lot of like founding fathers conversations. So yeah, I don't know. There's a way that like he becomes the bad one, and it's just insufficient, but whatever.
right. I mean, this is the kind of the problem with the great man or evil man theory of history, right? Is that ultimately this story can't help but tell history through the point of view of people, individual people, their desires, their mistakes. I think it does an incredible job at doing that. Like the characters in the play are extremely well developed, especially for basically not talking and developing only through song and dance. But it does, you know, make that fundamental attribution error of attributing history to individuals rather than, you know, systems and movements. Since 3 of the 4 of us have seen this as a show on stage, and I didn't get a chance to do my 2 cents at the top of the conference, but I was actually, not to brag, lucky enough to see this twice on stage. Once to talk about it on the Slate Culture Gab Fest, and to actually get to interview Daveed Diggs and Leslie Odom, which was fantastic. And then because I loved it so much, eventually we saved up so we could take my daughter to it, and she loved it too, and then became an obsession. Oh, look, our producer Faith put up a picture so I can remember my golden times on stage with Leslie and Daveed, my buddies. I really wish now that before I had talked to them, I knew the show better. I had just seen it once at that point. I didn't know the cast album super well. I hadn't read the Ron Chernow biography it's based on, which I've now read, and I would have had so many more questions for them if I had known a bit more then. But I guess I wanted to maybe switch to talking about, since three of us have seen this as a play, and then the other one of us doesn't like musicals in the first place, to talk about that translation from stage to screen and how you think that works. In other words, how does this function as a film? And, you know, when you were watching it and looking at the choices that the director, Tommy Kail was the director, correct, of the movie, who also directed the play on stage. When you looked at the choices he had made, how did that make the play read differently for you? How do you think it might have been filmed differently or better or worse? I'll start with Sam. What do you think? You're a film critic, so.
I mean, I think, you know, I think it is a better than serviceable capture of an obviously extraordinary performance. I think I get the sense watching this that Thomas Kail spent a lot of time watching Spike Lee's movie Passing Strange, which is a similar kind of filming a Broadway musical sort of in situ in the theater, you know, while it's happening. And I think that's like an incredible, I mean, I think Spike Lee is just an incredible director of performance films generally. And so I think he took a lot of inspiration from that, and that is wise. You know, it still has a kind of like PBS, like souped up PBS great performances feel to it. It's nice that they the way they did it is they shot a Sunday matinee and a Tuesday evening performance live, and then they spent the day in between. I think they shot 13 or 16 numbers. They just brought the cameras on stage and did, you know, crane shots and close-ups and stuff like that. And that definitely that adds to it. And you do see a lot of, I was not particularly close to the stage when I saw it. So just being able to see the nuances of those performances, and they're really not, often when you get that close to a stage performance, people can look really bad. Like it's one of the reasons film theater often doesn't work, because the performances are just, people are playing to the rafters and everything just looks kind of oversized and goofy. And I guess maybe because the show is so stylized to begin with, that like doesn't bother me too much. I mean, you're right up in Jonathan Groff's face as he's singing the King's three songs. I mean, he is like spewing saliva all over the lens, just like geysers of spit flying from his face. And it's still kind of amazing. You're not like, whoa, buddy, turn it down, you know, turn it down. You know, so just being able to see like the little exchanges between people, there's some great sort of like Daveed Diggs smirks. He's particularly playing Lafayette. He's such a cocky son of a bitch. And, you know, as Lin-Manuel Miranda plays Hamilton, especially in the first act, he's also just a really kind of, you know, smug and like fun of himself. So there's a lot of great little smirks and interactions and lots of little, you know, the choreography is very dense. And I feel like there are a lot of interactions that I can't imagine how many times you would actually have to see this on stage to get all of that. So it's really great to have that on film. And just, you know, watched the first half of it with my daughter yesterday, and just she was picking up on all these, you know, lighting and staging stuff. And she's, you know, 11 now. I don't know if she's going to be like a, you know, theater kid or not, but I'm just thinking of like theater kids having the opportunity to like study this show in that detail. And I don't think it's like an amazing show in terms of like as a work of theater. Like, I don't think the direction or the staging is particularly interesting, but those performances, like just to be able to study those up close in this detail is really just extraordinary. And I'm so glad that like not everybody, but a great many people now have the chance to do that.
Yeah, one example of that I noticed, Sam, is just little performance details that you wouldn't have been able to see, even sitting pretty close in the theater. I think like the fact that as Lafayette, when Daveed Diggs takes a drink from his goblet, he always has his pinky up just to be French. It's so good. Just tiny details like that. Rachel, did you have something that you noticed in seeing that translation?
As a former member of the Tumblr Hamilton community, there's actually
God bless. I love it
like,
so much.
I'm really revealing a lot about myself right now, but there's like actually like it's full of theater kids who have like bootleg copies. Sorry, Lynn, bootleg copies of like this play. So there's actually a lot of talk about staging and lighting, and so I also did not have great seats when I went to go see it because I bought it on an intern salary, and so there were things that I was looking for. There's like the dance when they're like singing this, like the reprise when they're all drunk after Hamilton gets like married. Oh, Dana's gone.
Oh, bye, Dana.
Oh, no. But there's also this part when Philip dies where Eliza pulls her hand away from Hamilton, and I think that's something that you don't see when you're like really far back, and it also makes when she like grabs her hand in the next scene like just move like mean a lot more. And yeah, so I was grateful for it. As a film, I don't know, when you hear soundtrack too many times, watching something on screen after you've heard it so many times, you kind of start tuning out visually, even because you know what's going to happen, even if you haven't necessarily seen it that close. So I can't say I watched this like super closely, but I really enjoyed being able to see everyone's expressions, and I really think that it gave a lot to the, because you don't see that even when they're acting for the Raptors. You're like, I don't really see what they're doing, like all these smirks. Like you can see in the way that Daveed Diggs moves that he's an actual rapper, like just the way that he talks.
Yeah.
Like those are things that you just don't notice. Obviously, I paid a lot more attention to Daveed Diggs than anyone else on stage because I love him.
He's wonderful.
He's wonderful.
Dancer. I mean, he just tells his character through his body so much, right? I mean, his entrance as Thomas Jefferson at the beginning of Act 2 is, I think, one of the high points of the play, and it all has to do with his way of moving.
Yeah.
It's also like interesting that this movie was, I mean, shot I think probably like over a year after they recorded the cast album that we all, or everyone except Rebecca, has committed to memory. And just like getting a sense of how, I mean, the performances in a studio and on stage are going to be different anyway, because people are kind of like gasping for breath and doing the choreography and everything else. But just to hear, how differently they're playing the roles, how differently they're hitting different lines like a year later is just like there's a whole like, term paper in that.
Yeah, definitely. Having seen it in Chicago with a completely different cast, I think that it's so different. I've been saying different a lot, but like just seeing it with a different cast, I think one of the things I realized is that Hamilton is supposed to be sexy, which Lin-Manuel Miranda is the opposite of sexy. I'm so sorry.
That didn't work for me at all. It didn't work for me at all.
I have something to say there, which is that both times I saw it was pretty much the original cast, almost everybody, except both times, well, he is part of the original cast, but both times it was Javier Munoz, who was, you wouldn't even call him the understudy. He was the other co-Hamilton from the beginning of the conception, along with Lin. And I just happened to hit 2 nights that was Javier. So to me, he was Hamilton. And he's a much more kind of virile performer. He's completely different. They look a bit alike on stage, but he's much more, I don't know how to describe it, like aggressive and not as sort of ingratiating as Lin-Manuel. So even though I was used to hearing Lin on the cast album, and I'm really glad, of course, that I got to see it with the guy who made the whole thing, I can see how, especially in the Reynolds pamphlet and, the sex stuff in the second half, how Javier is better suited for the role. But that is an interesting question. Let's just float the question of Lin really quickly as a performer of his own material. I mean, I think that we can all agree, maybe even Rebecca, who's not a fan of the whole project, that like it's a kind of extraordinary verbal work and musical work that he's created, right? But is he in a Ben Affleck situation where he should not be performing in his own material?
Step back from the play.
I don't think Lin is the best singer or rapper. I think that's very clear. I do think there's something about the person who's writing it, performing it, and I don't think I would have necessarily known that had I not seen like the Chicago cast. Like Miguel Cervantes as Hamilton made the character a lot more legible. When you watch Hamilton with Lin, you're kind of like, that's Lin. You're not like, that's Hamilton. Like, I look at him and I'm like, oh, this is the guy who sang the Moana soundtrack, He has such a distinctive voice that you can't, and like look that you can't quite separate Lin's persona from Hamilton the character. And so I do think that I'm glad that he's not doing it anymore.
Right. I think I was talking about this just like on Twitter the other day, and I feel like, I mean, Lin-Manuel Miranda is not like, if he were not the writer of the show and you were casting for that role, you would never cast him. He would probably not even get a call back. And I don't know that I'd want to see him like play the lead in anything that he didn't write. I mean, I think he's a very like charismatic person in a lot of ways, but like having seen him now in, Mary Poppins Returns, stuff like that, like it's not like, he's not that good. That stuff, I think there is something ineffable, I mean, you're to read through and this is a story about a writer with the writer, person who wrote it, playing the role. I mean, there is just something in that, you know, and I think he embodies that. He uses the word scrappy to describe himself, and there is something very kind of scrappy about, like, if he were, let's say, more obviously sexy, or, you know, better singer or rapper, that scrappy quality kind of might not be there, you know. And I think he has a couple, he's very good at like the choked up voice. Like, I think you know, there's a couple like powerful tricks that he has, and that's one of them. And he uses that like that like it's quiet uptown, you know, stuck in the throat voice, like that really works like gangbusters. But yeah, I do wonder. I mean, I wonder a lot. Like, just, and Rachel, you can speak to this. I mean, does the show even work with a whole other cast? Because like I can't imagine anybody other than Daveed Diggs playing Jefferson. I can't imagine not being like taking that role and not being completely terrified of it. Like, that just seems impossible to me. I'm well aware that many people have. I just can't imagine it.
I can say that it does work.
Okay.
The guy who played Jefferson in Chicago was amazing. I was also curious, going to see it. I was like, am I even gonna like this now that it's not Daveed Diggs? I feel like we all just love Daveed Diggs, but I did indeed still love it.
I mean, as you were saying, it is also it's a great launching ground for young actors of color. And I know my sister, who saw it with the San Francisco cast, said that she thought the guy who played Washington, I mean, she loves Chris Jackson on the cast album, but she was saying that guy was every bit as good and was possibly a more technically advanced singer. I mean, it just seems exciting to me that there's all these companies doing it all over the world, right, with different people interpreting the roles in different ways. I will say that this struck me sometimes, and this is more a critique for Tommy Kail than for the show as a director, but I thought that it was sometimes trying to be cinematic a little bit too hard, that it was so afraid of being a stiff proscenium play stuck on the stage with one camera angle on it, that the camera was sometimes cutting on action that I didn't want it to cut on, showing close-ups when I would have rather seen the whole stage. There was a Busby Berkeley moment, at least one, where the camera was way up at the top at the ceiling, you know, watching the kind of shapes of dancers arrange themselves. And moments like that sort of took me out of it. I would have preferred erring on the side of staginess to going too far into the realm of, you know, we're directing a basketball game, you know, promo trailer or something like that, where like the action is so stressed that you don't sort of see the whole shape of what's happening on stage.
I wonder about that, because I feel like as a non-theater person, I needed that stuff. Like, I needed to feel like I could see what was happening a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it was skillfully done in the sense that, you know, you're always looking at the person who the action is centering on at that moment. But sometimes I didn't want to see just that face necessarily.
It was interesting. Like, I was reading up on the production today, and apparently, because they shot this movie in 2016. They finished editing it in 2018, and then we're kind of, you know, tinkering with it. And eventually, as I said, we're going to release it next year. And then but, you know, it's been finished like a couple of times. And Tommy Kail apparently watched, I think it was Fosse Verdon, which Lin-Manuel Miranda like executive produced and he played Bob Fosse for like 5 seconds in that. But apparently that a lot of those showier kind of Busby Berkeley moments and the more frenetic cuttingness came out of him watching Fosse Verdon and maybe some Bob Fosse movies as well. But those were all like recent additions. They weren't sort of part of the original plan of how it was going to be cut together.
That's interesting. Yeah. From the point of view of a person who is like a relative newbie, I want to ask about the sort of like the informational aspect of this. So like beyond the question of like, is it accurate, or even like, is it politically progressive, is just like, did you understand what was going on? Like, I mean, I feel like there's just so much like historical information poured into things. And at times I felt like that was, again, as a newbie, like as a person who's not absorbed in the soundtrack the same way that you guys are, I felt like I was missing a lot of stuff. And so many times I just was like, I'd rather just read the book. Like, can I just have like a story about like a bunch of charismatic young people who have a rebellion, which is basically what it is. And then like have love affairs and intrigues. And then can I read a separate book about the American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention? Cause like, it's like a lot of it is kind of past me. And I wonder if you guys ever felt that at the beginning when you first had encountered this piece of intellectual property, and whether that went away once you became steeped in it.
Do you mean actually lyrically, Rebecca? Do you mean that like you were, because I mean, I'm sure this was true the first time I heard it, that you were having a problem just keeping up with all the words coming at you?
Yeah, keeping up with the words, but also keeping up with the what's conveyed in the parts of the plot that are not about like the personal conflicts between the people, but are about the stakes of the founding of the nation, and the different arguments that people are having. I felt ungrounded in a lot of that stuff, despite knowing like a little bit of it from other historical reading.
I wondered this a lot. I mean, historians aside, I wondered this a lot on first seeing it. Is just how would this strike someone who had no familiarity with the material? Sorry, Sam, I didn't mean to talk over you. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I mean, I was just going to say, like, the banking stuff lost me, but I think probably if I read a book about it, I would still not get it. So I'm just capable of understanding that stuff.
Well, I mean, there's also the other thing where people who have read a lot of books about that stuff are like, oh, it gets it wrong in this way and this way and this way. And so maybe it's better just to have it wash over me and not think about it too hard. But it did like sometimes irritate me trying to catch it and trying to incorporate that sort of like chewier historical part of it with the more personal parts.
Yeah, the show asks a lot from the viewer in that way, which makes it somewhat surprising to me that it became this pop smash hit and that, 8-year-old kids love it and stuff.
Yeah.
Because huge parts of it are about things like, oh, well, should the government assume the debts of the states and things like that are pretty dry historical concepts.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, so Rachel, you said that you started liking it when you were 19. Did it make you / your Tumblr Hamilton fandom friends want to know more about that stuff, or what kinds of what kinds of interest in the history did you guys have from it?
Yeah, I will say I didn't make fandom friends. I'm a lurker in fandom. Like I very rarely make friends just because everyone else gets like a little bit like far past my enthusiasm level, and I'm like I can't like they still own slaves. Like I'm still black. Like you can't. Yeah. I can't be on the same level. But I think that it never made me like want to read the biography, for example. Like I never really wanted to read beyond what was happening. But I will say that there were certain things that like you get kind of like indoctrinated into as someone who goes to school in high school, in America, that I didn't really understand. Like, I mean, for the longest time, I didn't quite understand why Washington left after 2 terms. I was like, what's the point? FDR was here for 4 terms. And then I think like I think I understood more about like the nation needing to move on beyond like this charismatic leader. I still don't understand the Treasury stuff. Like, I think a musical that made me actually want to learn more about the time period, and it's possibly just because you grow up listening to American history, but like, for example, Les Mis, like when I read that or like watched that for the first time, I was like, oh, I want to know more about this like small rebellion before like the big rebellion. Like what's going on here? Like we're the actual best, like who are the barricade boys? So I won't say this play made me want to dive deeper into the Revolutionary War, but I will say it made me understand some minor things a bit better. I would not teach this as in a class.
Well, I wonder if anyone's done that. I mean, it'll be interesting to try to, but it seems pedagogically exhausting because you just be like trying to be cool by being like, we're gonna. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and there's a point at which you sort of be like, well, this isn't historically accurately represent Hamilton's, positions on like national debt and credit. And it's like, well, also none of these people were black and they didn't rap. Like, I mean, if you want to, like, it's very clearly telling you that this is not accurate. Like from the second, like Aaron Burr steps on stage, if you don't know at that point. But I think there is like, one of the it's been funny in the last week to see a lot of the critiques that I've sort of felt got completely exhausted like 5 years ago, like coming back getting to it now. And so there's like, oh, this is like bad history and Lin-Manuel Miranda can't sing. And one of them is like, oh, this is bad rap. I don't like this because I'm a hip hop fan. And it's like, well, it's not, it's a hip hop musical, but like both of those words are important. Like this is, like Soraya McDonald was tweeting something like very smart about this, where she was saying like this is kind of a musical that like just adds hip hop to the Great American Songbook. So there's like, boogie woogie and ballads and kind of neoclassical and all this other stuff, and hip hop just like works its way in there. So it's, a musicalized version of hip hop. Like no one, apart from Daveed Diggs, like these are not like, rappers that they've like cast in this. Some of them are, more proficient than others, but it's not exactly like you wouldn't. The version of this, it was going to be like an actual like hip hop mixtape, which is supposedly what like Lin was working on at first, is like a little horrific to think about.
Yeah.
And that's where like this, that's like if you actually have like a rap album where people are talking about like, the Battle of Yorktown or whatever, that would be an utter nightmare. So it's just in this, context of a theatrical musical where that's one of the elements that comes in. I think it's like, I don't know. That it makes sense that way, at least.
Yeah, I feel like it's not good if like it's kind of a trifecta of like history, hip hop, musical, and if you take it like any of those three things separately, it sucks at doing that one thing separately. Like combined, it's a phenomenal product.
You make an excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I'm not gonna teach this as history. Like this is not the great example of hip hop. Okay, it's a good musical, so like it's fine of like doing that. But like any other, I'm not gonna go as like the best of what it could be.
And I don't really care whether or not it's accurate in a way, because I mean, I kind of give up on that kind of mode of critiquing historical entertainment. But I do think that it has like a like it's riding on the idea of historical accuracy in a way, like, or not accuracy, but like like historicness, I guess. Like it's if it's okay to bring in this question, we have a viewer question from a Buzz Anderson who asks, I agree it was a good musical, but why did the world go nuts over it? Which it's the question I really like. And I think that like that quality of like, you're getting history with this, like this, like sort of like like it's like a wholesomeness that allows it to be like a thing that goes to the White House and that Obama gives like props to, but is also, I mean, you wouldn't have that if it wasn't trying to be like in some way a historical thing. I don't know. So in some ways it tries to have it both ways, both like be a historical thing, but also be like self-consciously like, no, obviously this isn't real. But what do you guys think about that question? Why do you think the world went nuts over it?
I can't remember who said this. It was either Laura Michelle Jackson or Soraya McDonald, or I saw it on Twitter. But it kind of sums up the Obama administration. Like it's kind of the defining product of the Obama administration. And it came at the end of that administration. And I think it kind of fully like summed up what so many people loved about Obama, which is this kind of symbolic progressiveness that if you scratch the surface a little bit, you're like, well, maybe not. I think that it kind of like there's a hope there and a way in which that it allowed people to claim a history that they were a part of but never felt a part of. I think that's why, for people who look like me anyway, I think that's why it got really popular. Like, I think there are just like a lot of people who never felt like they were in American history in any like defining way, just like they never felt like they could be president. And then you see Obama and you see Hamilton and you're like, these things are accessible. And so I think in terms of an entry point of like progressiveness, if that's what it is, like you should read a little bit more beyond that. But I think that for what it was, it gave a lot of people hope. It gave like a lot of people just like a space to see themselves. Like it's kind of the best definition of like representational politics. And those politics have issues with them, but it's a very great example of what it is.
I'm just thinking of the moment. Oh, go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say, like, as with...
Go. I hate Zoom, by the way. This is the worst.
Yeah, I just think like as with Obama, and especially as we found like now as the the rosy glow of his presidency is kind of worn off. I mean, you realize like all presidents kind of he seems like, still seems to me like maybe the best like actual person to hold the office since I've been alive. But like he did terrible things because like all presidents do terrible things. He like, dropped, it's not like drum strikes on funerals and stuff. Like you apparently can't occupy that office without doing like something awful. So you scratch the surface of like any of these people in this play, and they're like all have done something terrible somewhere. But it is flush with the optimism like of that era, as Rachel was saying, and inevitably, like if you look at that a few years later, like maybe we were overdid it a little bit. Like we thought things were like better and changing, and that's like and then they got like much worse. So you just sort of look at it like some smiling picture of yourself in college when you don't know like what's going to hit you after you graduate.
Me in January.
Maybe you'd end up teaching it in a class as like a document of the Obama era, rather than like trying to teach it like as a like a history book. You teach it as like a historical document.
Yeah. I mean, I think like that optimism, so much of the American mythos is that this is like the greatest place in the world. Like there's just such like an inherent optimism and exceptionalism in American identity, and I think that a lot of people just never felt that. And then you kind of look at Daveed Diggs playing Thomas Jefferson, and you're like, there's like a little twinge of happiness, and then you kind of examine that later. You examine it once you're in the theater.
Yeah, I feel like the utopian energy of the show is really irresistible. Actually, the actor Heath Sanders tweeted about this and had some really interesting things to say about it. Who is an actor of mixed race who's always had mixed feelings about the show, but also the night of, I guess it was July 3rd, the night that it was going to premiere on Disney, was excited about it and was posting about how, this show is seductive and you can't resist its seductions. And maybe you shouldn't resist its seductions, but just, as you experience it critically, or at least bring that critical eye later on after you've enjoyed its pleasures. But because we're down to the last 10 minutes, I definitely want to talk about the ending, especially with Sam, who had a whole piece in Slate just about the ending of Hamilton and what you see in the film that you don't hear on the cast album. But before that, because I feel like we've been a little bit dour in our treatment of it so far, and I think all the stuff we're talking about is important, but I also just want to talk about its pleasures a bit, because personally I will say that I in 2020 did not feel a need to revisit Hamilton, and hearing that it was coming on Disney Plus made me feel not cranky toward the show, but a little cranky toward Disney Plus, honestly, and just trying to get us all to subscribe to watch their big blockbuster show. But on July 3rd, the night it premiered, I didn't watch it that night, but I was noticing people reacting to it on social media, and including a lot of cranks who I think had really made a whole personality out of not liking Hamilton or musicals before, who, unlike Rebecca, did not resist it, who were saying, okay, I have to admit, this is really catchy, and it was kind of fun to watch it vicariously seducing people and taking over their pleasure center, as I think this musical's really good at doing, and musicals are in general. So can each of you tell me something in it that you loved, like a moment or a performance or a song, like something that brought you unexpected pleasure? I shall start with Rebecca because she's the crank.
Oh, okay. Oh, sure. It's been mentioned a little bit, but the Jonathan Groff numbers as George III were so funny and spot on, and I had no idea he could sing like that. Like, it was amazing. I loved every second of those parts.
Yeah, that's a really, really fun part. It's a tiny part of the show, right? But the king just has you in the palm of his hand. And I have to say, I didn't see Groff in that role. I saw Andrew Rannells as the king, and he was so damn funny. I mean, the audience was just like waiting to go home with him. He was so adorable. All right, what about you, Rachel?
I mean, Daveed Diggs obviously is my favorite part of this entire musical. I feel like he's not in enough things, and I love being able to see him in this specific thing that like launched him into like most of our collective orbits, zeitgeist, whatever. I mean, I love musicals. I think they're very corny and they're very earnest. And if you are a person who's like kind of averse to earnestness, in a way, it's like very hard to like sit through. But I deeply love corny things, and so I love it. I love it.
Yeah, it's pretty irresistible in that way. I mean, I've seen it twice in the last week, and it pretty much got me both times. What about you, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, you said unexpected pleasures, and I feel like, most of the pleasures I've gotten from it were expected just because I know the show so well. But I mean, one of the things I've really enjoyed is just like little moments of not even choreography but performance. Like there's a lot of, lyrical musical callbacks to earlier parts in the show. People like pick up other people's lines and stuff like that. And just seeing that there's actually like little bits of, choreography that come back to, like when Hamilton is saying, you get love for it, you get hate for it, you get nothing if you wait for it. And he does like a little sort of mockery of like Leslie Odom's, like amazing number. And then he just kind of like turns it into this complete, like shit talking him. And I love like those little callbacks to it, which are so kind of theatrical in nature. And again, just like getting up close to like a bunch of the performances, like this, just the sort of fierce, like, intelligence of wit of Renee Lee Goldsboro. Really have for some reason been really into like just the kind of swing in Chris Jackson's performance as Washington. Like he's even like farther off the beat than Daveed Diggs. He's just like kind of in his own universe, but always kind of comes back to home like right when he needs to. I think it's just an extraordinary performance.
Yeah, Chris Jackson. There's a moment, and this kind of goes back to stuff that you can see in the film version that you couldn't have seen in the play. But did you notice that Chris Jackson's first entrance as Washington, he backs onto the stage, but the camera's behind him, right? So there's this great little moment, almost like a, just a behind the scenes standing in the wings moment where you see his fierce Washingtonian expression as he backs onto the stage rather than the back of his head, which is all you would see in the theater. I think maybe my unexpected pleasure, although I loved it in performance too, it was just something that really popped on film more, was Philippa Sue's performance as Eliza, which is so quiet, right? I mean, it's part of her character to be quiet and reserved, and her performance compared to Renee Lee Goldsberry's is less, obviously she takes up less space on stage, right? And her character takes up less space. But there's this almost very relaxed quality to her performance in this movie. Her singing is so effortless and so pure. She just has an incredible soprano. I think as part of the ensemble, I had certainly appreciated her when I saw it, and I've always pictured her as that character, but it gave me that same feeling you were talking about with Daveed Diggs, Rachel, of just how could anyone else ever do this? Imagine replacing Philippa Sue as Eliza. All right, we're down to our last 5 minutes, and so we need to talk about the ending. This is a spoiler special. Yeah. There's not a lot to spoil in a property that people know as well as they know Hamilton. But Sam, tell us your argument and the the questions about the ending, the fan theories too that have started to revolve around Eliza's very last moment, and maybe describe for somebody who hasn't seen the show or play yet what her last moment.
Right, there's a couple little moments that are in the show that did not make it to the album. Like the biggest of them that people know is sort of like the secret scene where Hamilton finds out about John Lauren's death, which I think they cut from the album just because either it was too long or because that scene is like actually mostly spoken. But there is this one moment at the end, which I remember really shocked me when I saw it because I knew the album so well, is, the album gets to the end of the song and they're singing, and everybody just kind of fades out and then use this unison note. And you assume that there's just like the lights fade out and then they come back up and everybody claps. And when you see it, what actually happens is that Hamilton leads Eliza to the lip of the stage. Hamilton is dead at this point, but kind of his specter leads her up there. She's taken over from Burr as the narrator in that last song. She is the one who's taking over charge of his story, placing herself back in the narrative. And she goes to the lip of the stage, kind of, looks up at something into the lights as that last note is going. And she just lets out, there's this expression on her face of just kind of like wonderment and fear. And the movie gets you like right up close and she just lets out this kind of gasp. And that's when the lights smash to black. And like Lin-Manuel has completely refused to explain it. He was just tweeting today, like the gasp is the gasp. Philippa Sue won't say what she's playing. Like sometimes, it's this, sometimes it's that, sometimes it's just Philippa sees the audience. One of the more popular theories, and there's a TikTok going around about this now, is that that's where Eliza sees the audience. Like in the TikTok, it's not even Hamilton leading her to the lip of the stage. It's actually Lin-Manuel Miranda, who has like come out of character and is showing her that like all these people have shown up to see her story. I think I reject that in part just because I hate the idea that the last thing this musical might do is congratulate the audience for showing up and be like, the story's so important because you're here. Yeah. And it may be a very, it may be a very audience flattering work to begin with, but that's just like too much. My feeling is, if you watch particularly the blocking of that scene, and I keep meaning to go back and watching if this is true in Burn as well, when she uses you in that last scene, every time she does it, she kind of looks up as if she's talking to Hamilton, who's dead, to his spirit or whatever, and she's kind of looking up into the rafters, and that's where she goes back at the end. So it's like her reunion with him. I don't know if it's necessarily the afterlife. I mean, it's a show that's kind of threaded through with, biblical themes and scriptural quotes, but they're mostly, related to Burr, because his grandfather was a sort of extremely renowned preacher. But to me, there's also just the idea that like you keep your loved ones alive by like telling their story. That idea that the moment you die is the last time someone says your name, and that by basically kind of curating his legacy, that she was keeping their relationship alive. I think there's something really powerful in that.
And there is no gasp on the cast album. Did any of them ever talk about that? About why they didn't choose to include that moment in the cast album?
I don't think they have to. It would be a really weird thing, like on a recording, if you can't see her expression, it's just be like, what is that?
Right.
I think it's better to just fade out on the record.
But it is such a transcendent moment of the show. And I remember the first time seeing it on stage being incredibly impressed with the ambiguity of the ending. You might say that in some ways the show is a civics lesson that's hammering stuff into your head, but the end is very far from that. It just seems like this moment of transcendence that you can't really pin down. Okay, we're at the end of our hour. Do either of you have any of you have any last words or thoughts or admonitions or warnings for people wondering if they should see Hamilton?
I feel like people need to get a tween to watch it with or something. I feel like my lack of a tween has seriously harmed me.
I mean, would you say specifically, any of you, would you say that it'd be a good idea to know the songs a little better, that you should listen through a few times to maybe not feel that confusion that Rebecca did?
Yeah, I think the first time I listened to the cast album, I caught 60% of what was going on. So maybe listen to it a few times and it'll be a bit less annoying. I don't know. I feel like this is aggressively not your shit, though, Rebecca. So I don't want to make it your shit.
I completely agree. I don't think anybody should be. I mean, Rebecca, yes, because I want to hear her as a historian talk about it. But I would not say for entertainment purposes that anyone has to go see Hamilton if they don't care about it. Then again, if you're on the fence and you're kind of like, not a musical person, as I say, I've seen in my own life someone be converted from not a musical person to really loving this musical. I don't know.
That's a good point.
All right, I think that is our first ever live spoiler special at Slate. I'm sorry about my falling in and out of technological touch with you all, but I think I still got to hear a lot of the conversation. It was great. Thank you to everyone who tuned in, and you made this live event really fun. We hope to do more with you soon. Please subscribe, if you can, to the Slate Spoiler Special podcast feed. And if you like this show, you can, of course, tweet about it or rate it or review it in the Apple Podcast Store, which really helps people to find the show and other Slate podcasts. If you have suggestions for future spoiler specials, we do movies, we do TV shows, we do podcasts. You can send them to spoilers@slate.com. Also, we want to send a big thank you to Faith Smith, who was behind the scenes figuring out all my bizarre technical problems and helping to set this all up from a tech point of view. Thanks so much. And to Britt Pulley, who also helped produce this and other Slate Live events. And everybody, please come back here next Wednesday night. There's going to be a live recording of the Slate Money podcast. So please join in for that if you would like to. Our producer today was Rosemary Belson. For Sam Adams, Rachelle Hampton, and Rebecca Onion, I am Dana Stevens. Thanks for listening, and we'll spoil again with you soon.
Bye.
Bye.